Hi, we continue today in Genesis 40 as we've been reviewing the way these three stories in Genesis 39, 40, and 41 fit together to form this nice little triptych, as you can see on the right side of the screen, all involving Joseph in the custody of the officer of the guard, who starts off as Potiphar and then ends up being anonymous in our current chapter 40 and continuing in chapter 41. And you can see some of the other ways our chapters fit together. So we've been also noting the shape of the story. If I zoom back out, you can see that the beginning and the end match here around the cupbearer and the baker officer and Pharaoh and the question of the dream, as you see. And then the inner part here, which is not all a chiasm, it is three sequential paragraphs. We saw the last one, which did form a little ABA chiasm around the fact of the two of them having a dream. Today we're going to look at the cupbearer's dream, and next time we'll look at the baker's dream, which are parallel but not chiastic in that way. And today in particular, we're going to see the whole sequence of rare words that we see in our in this whole unit of 40 and 41. But you can see here in verse 40, chapter 40, verse 9, 6 different words that are only here or only one other place in Genesis, and then a couple more in verse 10. So all the elements of this dream are unique here, and whether that's because we're in the foreign court, a place we've not been before in Genesis, or because, as some scholars have claimed, this is from a different source than the rest of Genesis and therefore is using a different vocabulary, both of those could be true. But even if it was from the same source as the primeval history, Genesis 1 to 11, or the patriarchal matriarchal stories from 12 to 36, they'd still need a special vocabulary to express what was going on in this dream in the royal court. So we don't need to make a decision on that one way or another, but just note all this special language here. And as I was noting last time, and we'll look at it again today just briefly, of all these different dreams in the Hebrew Bible, the only other one that involves a question of whether God is involved in the interpretation is the one in Daniel 2. And I won't look again today. We looked at last time. We'll look more in detail when we get to Genesis 41 of the many parallels and then the differences between Joseph in Genesis 41 and Daniel in chapter 2 of the book of Daniel. But one of the big differences is there Daniel says interpretations are from God, but when the question is to understand what the dream is and how to interpret, he turns directly to God and is given a vision. Whereas we saw last time that Joseph simply narrated, and you can see that from this chart here, that all the interpretations belong to God. He asked it as a rhetorical question. And perhaps the authors are asking that as a rhetorical question, and the answer might be, no, they do not. Because as we've seen throughout the rest of these, whether in Genesis or otherwise, other than the one in Daniel, God was not involved in the interpretation at all. Abimelech understood what was going on, as did Jacob, as did Laban, and other than Pharaoh, only Nebuchadnezzar doesn't understand his own dreams other than these Egyptians. So as I was looking at last time, some of that might well be the imperial desire to control the production of knowledge, even dream knowledge, so that people are disempowered from interpreting it themselves. But that doesn't stop Joseph. And as I hope we'll see in this, Joseph's interpretation could well simply be based on his careful observation of what's going on amongst the officers of Pharaoh, where he's been residing in the dungeon, in the pit, for some unspecified amount of time now. So let's look more closely at that as we jump in. So we ended on the question of please tell them, and so now we get to verse 9, where the cupbearer begins to announce the dream. As Westerman notes below, both dreams are lively miniature descriptions of life at Pharaoh's court, which remind one of Egyptian art. And you can see an example of that here in this piece of an Egyptian sequence of Egyptian slaves tending to grapevines and also bringing them to Pharaoh. And you can also see at least one example of a reproduction of King Tut's specific royal cup into which his wine would be poured. And as you can see down below, note the contrast between these dreams and Joseph's dream. There's an intricacy in the structure of these new dreams. They're not static repetitions of iconic images, and there are tangible implications attached to these dreams. But would there be if Joseph hadn't figured that out? That's one of the interesting questions. And so many scholars assume what Joseph announces, that this is the right interpretation because God has given it to him as some kind of magical gift. But I'm going to suggest another way to read this. So the cupbearer officer told the dream, and as I noted last time, the word for telling a dream is a word that otherwise means other things, but is used consistently for telling dreams here. So he told his dream to Joseph and said to him, and note that the narrator is telling us he told the dream and then narrating it. So this might have been he just told the dream, but now we're hearing it. So, and we can look at my translation here on the right side where there's a couple of differences we'll see. But in my dream, behold, that's one of the key ones you see right there, there was a vine. And curiously, perhaps, the Hebrew word for vine, geffen, is for the first time here in the book of Genesis. And given how the prayer over the wine and over the bread are such basic Jewish prayers both in the ancient world and now, it's perhaps surprising. But there's a very specific sequence to having vine. As we'll see in Deuteronomy 8:8, you can see on the screen here, the promise of everybody having their own vine and fig tree. And then in this propagandistic statement from the time of Solomon, everybody was under their vine and fig tree. So that certainly expresses a sense of royal abundance, prosperity. And notice how in both cases it's a prosperity of domestication, of taking the events of nature of grapevines and of fig trees and turning them into royal accommodation. So rather than it coming from God, they come from the king. But that's part of the religion of empire, religion of creation issue that my larger trajectory around the Bible is about, but just to note that here. So there's a vine. But the dream is very active. There's a whole sequence here, and I could make a little video of it with AI, I'm sure, today, but I'll spare you that, and we'll just look at a couple of images that hopefully illustrate what's going on. As Grossman notes, he highlights that this is not part of the cupbearer's usual duties and seemed to go uninterpreted by Joseph. He links it with the piece of the interpretation not seemingly linked to the dream. Quote, the blossoming of the vine seems to symbolize the regrowth of the cupbearer himself. And that may well be. Neor adds below that suggests Joseph as Israel and the cupbearer as Judah, noting the wine link in chapter 49 and Jeroboam's descent from Ephraim. We'll look at that more closely when we get to that in 49, but that's around Jacob blessing his sons there and what that has to do with Jeroboam. But we'll look at that more when we get there. So on the vine, there were 3 branches, and that's an interesting thing. Grapevines don't normally branch exactly that way. Now, the best I could come up with from the Egyptian context, as you see here, is this image here. But it literally means plus a third. And as Sherman notes below, additionally, the number 3 appears in hidden context in another 9 cases, either as threefold repetitions of specific word roots or as 3-unit action sequences. And you can see how what Sherman's pointing out about the 3s is prevalent throughout this whole chapter, as you can see below. So not only the use of words 3 times, but also scenes that we see used several times, and sequences of verbs, as we'll see in our immediate passage here several times. So 3s are definitely the element of this scene here, whereas in chapter 41, it'll be 7s. So in the vine there were 3 branches, and again, this is one of those rare words. As soon as it budded, and a curious thing of grapevines is that the flowers on grapevines are very indistinct, as you can see here. So the story features the budding and the blossoms. Grapevine blossoms are really not a highlight, but it's certainly what it's showing is the fertility that's going on here. And so the blossoms came out and clusters ripen into grapes. So the entire agricultural cycle is happening right before our eyes here. And again, clusters only here in Genesis, as well as ripening only here in Genesis, as well as the grapes only here. And then, as I was noting earlier in the echo in chapter 49 in the blessings Jacob gives to his sons. So that whole sequence happens all in one verse, and the vine goes into grapes. It doesn't ever say they become wine, but we continue in verse 11 as he tells the story. As Hamringhausen notes, he omits one crucial detail. The grapes on the vine are being turned into wine before going into the cup. Although it doesn't say that. Maybe it was just grape juice in his dream. After all, it's only a dream. So note Pharaoh 3 times in the verse, one of those examples I was just highlighting. And Pharaoh's cup, Kos, only here in Genesis, and you can see an example. So it's noting of King Tut's, replica of King Tut's cup. And I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup. As you can see here, although not pressed into Pharaoh's cup as such. So he's doing all the functions here of having watched it grow, of being the person who makes the wine, although that would not have been part of his job. The wine would, of course, come to him, and simply his job to place the cup in Pharaoh's hand, as we see here, which is one of those things that obviously highlights how trustworthy the cupbearer is. I was noting over against the old King James, it referred to him as the butler. He's hardly the butler. Nehemiah, for the king of Persia, was the person he set out to become the governor of the province of Yehud. You wouldn't put your butler in charge of that. So now Joseph's about to have the interpretation, but before he does, let's consider it for ourselves. As I've been noting, Joseph has been with these people. As the previous scenes show, they know him and he knows them. There's no need to introduce each other, and that makes perfect sense. They're part of the small group of retainers in the royal court, and he's been staying with Potiphar, and now he's in the prison that's in the prison house that Potiphar or his successor lives in. So he's been around all these people, and he's certainly been watching Pharaoh, and it should not be surprising to him to know that once the cupbearer and the baker ended up in the prison, that Pharaoh was mad at them, and that would mean their jobs were at risk. And perhaps he's observed even more carefully enough to know that whatever it was that pissed off Pharaoh for a moment, it wasn't as important to the cupbearer as it was about the baker. In other words, he's doing a Sherlock Holmes, perhaps. And nobody thought of Sherlock Holmes as depending upon God, whether the old version or the Benedict Cumberbatch version, or in a more recent show, The Mentalist, where the main character played here by Simon Baker was a disgraced psychic who goes on the rampage to say there are no psychics, as he works for the California Department of Investigation in order to find people. But he's not doing magic tricks. He's just a careful observer of human behavior and of what people are saying and doing. And certainly Joseph is at least that as well. So we have no need to attribute this to God, and God is never said to have done it. That's simply Joseph's claim. But let's hear the interpretation that he comes up with no hesitation at all. As Westerman notes, only the three part is allegorical, quote, in the line of professional Egyptian dream interpretation. The rest is along the lines of a parable rather than allegory. Basic to its interpretation is his knowledge of the situation, which is exactly the point. That he understands the situation very well, apparently better than the cupbearer and the baker understand it themselves, and can simply say what he's seen is the likely outcome. And so this is what happens. This is its interpretation, using pitron, as I was noting earlier, not a rare word, because the number of times that only these in this chapter and the next chapter in the entire Hebrew Bible. The three branches are 3 days. And notice he doesn't say it'll happen in 3 days. He says within 3 days. So a vague sense of very soon. Pharaoh will lift up your head, which is a word play that will play out in the opposite against the baker's dream, as we'll see next time. As Westerman notes below, literally this is a ceremonial act which takes place in an audience, which is to say to restore someone to office so that everybody can see. The word for restore is returned, as it is throughout. So just as the question of returning from one place to another here, returning to his office. And that's exactly what happens. Return you to your office. Although it's not sar here, it's not the word for officer. It's an unusual word, usually meaning thus, but again in 41:13. Grossman suggests the basic meaning as stand firm or be stable, extended metaphorically to personal status. But another sense is sapling or even vine, hence an undertone of restore you to your vine. Perhaps just a word play there that whether Joseph intends that or the authors intended, it's hard to say. And you shall place Pharaoh's cup in your hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer, highlighting that Joseph knows he was the cupbearer. He hasn't said that, and the fact that he had this dream could mean he was dreaming of being a cupbearer, as Solomon will dream in 1 Kings of God giving him authority, although the text never says directly that God gave him authority. So having quickly dispatched that, notice how quickly he says, here's its interpretation. He's like he's rushing to get it out of his mouth so he can get to what really matters, which is remember me here. As my note below has, Joseph's speech of self-interest amidst the concerns of imperial servants both speaks to the dependence of Joseph on the chesed, which is the word we see here translated as kindness, and remembrance of others despite his borrowed imperial power, but also anticipates and summarizes the cry of the Israelites after him under Pharaoh and of those in Babylonian exile. The fact that he will be forgotten by the cupbearer yet remembered by God reminds readers who to rely on, as in Exodus another Pharaoh comes along who doesn't know Joseph. And as the note further down below from White notes, here Joseph takes control of his life. However, his clever scheme comes to naught. There is no relation between Joseph's virtuous acts and his fate. And as he continues, one of the chief tenets of wisdom teaching is that wisdom is the most certain path to success. This sequence of events illustrates the opposite. Joseph's every effort proves fruitless. It is only God who is the decisive acting subject of this narrative. And I think that's a key point, especially against scholars who want to see Joseph as a wisdom figure here because of his dream interpretation. What he is a clever narcissist who's concerned as much about himself getting out as he is for any actual concern for the cupbearer or the baker at all. It's all about him. him, remember me when it is good with you. And he does at least ask, please do me the chesed, a word attributed otherwise to God's essential quality, almost untranslatable, but of covenant faithfulness, regardless of how the Israelites and Judahites respond, to make mention, which is the same word. So remember me, please do me the chesed to remember me to Pharaoh and get me out of this place. Using the technical term for Exodus as in Exodus 3:10, just in the same way we can see the remembering from Exodus 2:23 to 25 worth looking at here, that it's God who remembers and gets them out of Egypt. But it'll be Joseph who ends up putting them in the very Egypt that God will get them out of. Joseph doesn't want to get out of Egypt. He just wants to get out of the prison. He's going to be deeply invested in his relationship with Egypt, as we'll see in the next chapter. And then he goes on to continue. Here's the reason why the cupbearer should remember for him. Because I was stolen, yes, stolen, doubled, as you can see on the right side over there, out of the land of the Hebrews. A very rare and actually confusing statement. Sternberg, who's done more to elucidate the meaning of Ebri, the Hebrew word for Hebrew, as crossers than anybody alive, or maybe anybody ever, notes here below. Now, Joseph, quote, identifies himself to Pharaoh's courtier by his homeland rather than directly by his race, which would misfocus his story of kidnapping from home across the border, and which has already weighed against him in the Potiphar affair. Having a country of his own, so the indirection argues, he never meant to impose himself elsewhere on people abroad. And that's bringing up the reminder that Mrs. Potiphar said as an accusation that her man, her husband, had brought this Hebrew in to mock us, treating it as a racial difference between the Hebrews and the Israelites. But he's basically saying, I wasn't trying to do anything in this land. I just was put here. I didn't mean to do anything here. And as he says, I have done nothing, or I have not made anything. As Westerman notes here, for the first time, Joseph declares his innocence. That they have put me into the pit, not the prison house, but the pit, as he sees it here, using the word bore. And as Rabel notes below, he has been cast into a hole in the ground again. And using this word, of course, the same word that his brothers, for what his brothers threw him in back in chapter 37, as you can see in my note below, links the current specific imprisonment with his entire ordeal, or perhaps simply referring back to that the they being the brothers, not the Egyptians. And so, do we feel sympathy for Joseph here? Well, of course, he's a prisoner and he really has done nothing wrong at this point. We'll see how long our sympathy and empathy for him last when Pharaoh makes him his right-hand man coming up very soon. We'll continue with this then. See you next time.